Good evening. My name is Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange. It's my great pleasure to be able to play our part in kicking off the commemorations for the 40th anniversary of the outbreak of the Falklands War. It's a particular pleasure to be able to welcome you all here tonight for the inauguration of our new offices, and I think it's a fantastic new venue and the right topic with which to kick these new offices into being. And it's a particular pleasure to be able to welcome our former Chair of Trustees, Charles Moore, obviously authorised biographer of Margaret Thatcher, and we were delighted to be able to launch the final volume of his trilogy several years ago with the Prime Minister, which describes her last term in office, her overthrow, and the broader theme of the lioness in winter. The thoughts today, of course, are with one of her greatest, perhaps indeed in the view of many, her greatest triumph, and Charles is going to discuss both the war itself and the lessons for current conflict. It's a particular pleasure to be able also to welcome a large number of veterans of the conflict here tonight, such as Lord West, former captain of HMS Ardent, and also to be able to welcome the last surviving member of the Falklands War Cabinet, Sir John Knott, here today, and of course, in fact, in the light of the demise also of the Argentinian, every member of the Argentinian junta of 1982. In fact, he's the last one of the major dramatis personae of the war. Also a great pleasure to be able to welcome many friends of ours online, such as John Lehman, who was US Navy Secretary at the time, and is again the last major figure from the Reagan administration to have played a major part in the supply and assistance to British forces in that conflict. We're going to first hear this great event tonight is also being listened to by many people in the Falkland Islands. Indeed, I'm told the majority of the population of the islands are tuning in to the event. The time difference is not so massive, but we're particularly pleased in these opening moments to be able to welcome Leona Roberts, MLA, a member of the Falklands Legislative Assembly. I don't know whether you can hear me now or whether this is possible to link up with her, certainly keen to do so. Leona, are you there? Do we have anything live from the Falklands? We may have to defer it till later in proceedings. Unmute. Do I have to unmute or does she have to unmute? She has to unmute.
Yes, good evening, good afternoon. It's lovely to be with you.
Do you want to say just a few words now?
Oh, thank you. Yes, my apologies. I thought I was speaking afterwards, right? Well, I'm very, very happy to be with you. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I've just been asked to speak for a couple of minutes about some of my memories and thoughts about 1982 and, of course, Baroness Thatcher herself. So I was 10 years old in 1982, living here in Stanley. So I have very clear memories of all of the events of those days. It was, of course, a very difficult, traumatic time for Falkland Islanders and something that we still carry with us today. Initially, of course, there was the shock of hearing that we were about to be invaded, and then, of course, the helplessness in the face of what was happening to our home and to our community. But I remember well also the sense of relief and some comfort in hearing that the British government had determined to restore our freedom and to know that within a few short days that the task force was being deployed to the islands. I think we all hoped, of course, that war and loss of life could be averted, but sadly that was not to be. So Falkland Islanders, of course, forever grateful to all the members of the task force for the liberation of the islands and restoring freedom to our home. And we recognise, and again, we'll never forget the sacrifices that were made on our behalf for such a small community. So the lives lost and the wounds, both physical, of course, and emotional, that were suffered by so many in that process. Sorry. Sorry, I've got somebody at the door there. So yes, of course. I mean, it must have been an incredibly difficult decision to make to deploy the task force. And again, Falkland Islanders will never forget and always be grateful for the decisiveness of Mrs. Thatcher and her government at the time. Taking those decisions must have been very, very challenging and massively appreciated. On a personal note, I was very excited to meet Mrs. Thatcher, albeit briefly, when she visited the islands in January 1983. I got her autograph twice, and I'm not sure actually if you'll be able to see this, but I will try. So this is my autograph book from a very long time ago. And firstly, I had her sign here on a page which is also signed by Major General Jeremy Moore. And you'll see in my fairly poor handwriting underneath, I did note that Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, as if anybody would not know that. But anyway, she also signed it a little further on. I caught her twice, once outside Government House, once outside the Post Office. So Mrs. Thatcher there and Dennis Thatcher below, and that was during her visit. So that's always been a prized possession of mine. And as I say, it sort of makes me smile a little bit to think that I felt that I needed to write in who she was. But anyway, I was very young. So in Heritage Year, 9 years after that initial visit, the Legislative Assembly at the time took the decision to mark that visit by establishing Margaret Thatcher Day on 10th January today. And that is something that we continue, and I'm sure always will continue to note. MLAs were very pleased this morning to lay flowers on behalf of the Falklands community at the Thatcher bust, which is alongside the Liberation Monument here in the islands. And very pleased to pay our respects to a woman who will always be very fondly remembered in the Falklands for those decisive actions in 1982. And of course, the support given to the islands in the years that followed. So this is a very special year for us, 40th anniversary. It's time for us to pay our respects to all the members of the task force, to the fallen, and to everybody in the years since who have done so much for us. It's also an opportunity for us to celebrate how far we have come in those 40 years. The islands have developed tremendously, and we've made a huge amount of progress, and that will continue in the years to come as we seek to pay the best tribute that we can to everybody who sacrificed on our behalf. We believe very much that making the Falklands the best, the strongest community that it can be, economically and politically, quite independent and strong in our decision making, that is the ultimate tribute that we can make. So yeah, I'm very happy to take any questions, of course, if there are any, but thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you. I think this is a fantastic event, and I'll go back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation. And just on the running order tonight, Charles will deliver his lecture first. He'll then open the floor to questions. If anyone on the virtual audience wishes to stick up their electronic hand, please do so now, as well as obviously those in the room. And then the proceedings will be wound up by Right Honourable Ben Wallace MP, Secretary of State for Defence, whom we're delighted to welcome back here and to inaugurate this new space. Thank you, Charles. Thank you for your efforts here, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Some water. And forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, I may cough. It's not COVIDic, but it's still there. It's lovely to be here tonight, and it is indeed Margaret Thatcher Day in the Falklands, because the date marks her first visit there 39 years ago, her first sight of the place, which under her leadership had been liberated by British troops from Argentine invaders the previous June. I'm really honoured that the Falkland Islands government has chosen me to deliver the lecture to commemorate this special day and mark the approaching 40th anniversary. And I must thank my friend Richard Hislop, the island's representative in London, for issuing the invitation. Richard, are you there? I think you are. Yes, no, thank you. Thank you. And also I must thank Leona Roberts for those charming words. There are lovely pictures of her, which I think she was waving, but I'm not sure we could. There are lovely pictures of her, which I think she was waving, but I'm not sure we could see them. But they're very nice pictures of her importuning Lady Thatcher twice for the signature. This event is being watched in the islands themselves, and I hereby send greetings to all of you there. In the run-up to the conflict 40 years ago, President Ronald Reagan slightly disparagingly referred to your home as that little ice-cold bunch of land down there. But at this season, it's actually a bit colder in this little bunch of land up here from which I'm speaking than it is with you. So I hope you're enjoying your summer more than we're enjoying our winter. I also read that you have experienced no deaths from COVID-19. Congratulations, we really envy you. And I must thank Policy Exchange too, and its dynamic director, Dean Godson, for providing me with this platform and this august live audience Dean has gathered in London to hear it. Particularly thrilled, of course, that there are several veterans here. And particularly pleased that the Secretary of State, Ben Wallace, is here and will speak to us briefly afterwards. He does not make the widespread 21st century error of assuming that old wars have nothing to teach us about new ones. Now, I'm not, however, a war historian or an expert on warfare. So my only qualification for speaking to you is that I'm the authorised biographer of Lady Thatcher. The first 2 chapters on the Falklands War form the climax of my first volume, Not for Turning. It was perhaps her most remarkable triumph, and the only matter about which she wrote a personal, passionate, and originally private memoir under the unromantic title of Notes on the Emergency Cabinet Committee. And by the way, while I've been working on this, it's only just occurred to me, I should have thought it before when I wrote the book, why did she do this? Why did she call it Notes on the Emergency Cabinet Committee? And I think that it was because she was absolutely paranoid about the idea that ministers shouldn't write diaries and memoirs and things while they were in office. She was always imposing that on other ministers. And so I think in order to justify her own action in nearly breaking her rules, she thought it better to call it Notes on the Emergency Cabinet Committee. And returning to the subject gives me a particular personal pleasure too, because in early 1981, I was a 24-year-old leader writer. 1982, I was a 24-year-old leader writer on the Daily Telegraph, the paper for which I still work 40 years later. The Falklands was the first really big news story I had encountered. The war in the metaphorical trenches of Fleet Street remains vivid in my memory, and I've been trying to learn lessons from it ever since. A subsequently very important person who learnt lessons was a young Labour candidate who unsuccessfully fought a by-election in the middle of the Falklands conflict. His name was Tony Blair, and interestingly, Beaconsfield by-election. And it's the only time I remember a candidate with no hope being praised by journalists. It's quite interesting that they'd already spotted him. I remember them reporters coming back from the Beaconsfield by-election saying this is a remarkable young Labour candidate called Tony Blair. He entered Parliament in the following year. One reason for his breakthrough as Labour leader in the 1990s was his determination to study Mrs. Thatcher's achievements rather than just excoriate them, and to persuade his party that to change it must welcome the best of them. He admired her success in the Falklands War. This was generous and astute of him, but it may have tempted him into the error of thinking that wars are easily won. This was not a mistake Mrs. Thatcher herself made. Although the Falklands conflict turned out to be a success for her, it was also a trauma for her because she felt it so deeply. Robert Armstrong, the Cabinet Secretary and therefore Secretary to the War Cabinet, which the Prime Minister hastily set up as the crisis broke, once told me that the Falklands War was the single part of her time during which Mrs. Thatcher lived most intensely. I think that's a good way to put it. She came to see so many things in the light of her Falklands experience. She judged people, both British and foreign, by how they had behaved in the crisis. Had they been, to use her favourite adjective, staunch, or had they been, quote, wobbly or worse? For example, she was frequently indulgent afterwards to François Mitterrand, the socialist president of France, because he had hurried to support Britain immediately after the Argentine invasion. Equally, she was ever afterwards intensely suspicious of Charles Hockey, the Irish Prime Minister, for what she saw as the diplomatic games he had played against Britain during the conflict, and so on. The same applied to her judgment of institutions. She never forgot or wholly forgave the Foreign Office failures over the Falklands, although she was grateful to the leading diplomats of the war, Anthony Parsons and Nicholas Henderson. She always, on the other hand, greatly appreciated the help provided by the British Antarctic Survey. As a result, it was to the BAS that she later listened about global warming, partly because of its persuasion. She herself came to expound the theory of man-made climate change in her famous speech to the Royal Society in 1988. In all her subsequent actions on the world stage, notably the preparation for the first Gulf War of 1991, and above all her entire approach to ending the Cold War, Mrs. Thatcher drew on Falklands experiences to guide her judgment of situations and sharpen the principles of conduct she wished to uphold. The Falklands War also taught her things about herself which she had not known before. Always conscientious, she had tried to prepare thoroughly for becoming Prime Minister, but that training certainly had not included the recovery by force of a small colony on the other side of the world. Yet she accomplished it at a time when, for economic reasons, her political authority at home was weak, and she had not yet had a chance to prove that Thatcherism could work. In military or naval terms, Mrs. Thatcher knew nothing about war before April 1982. Of the top 20 or so people dealing with the Falklands crisis, she was one of a handful who had not fought in the Second World War or done national service after it. She was also, of course, the only woman among that elite, so she felt vulnerable to male disdain. Not for nothing, just as the task force was leaving Portsmouth to make for the South Atlantic, did she invoke the words of another woman, Queen Victoria, that, quote, "the possibilities of failure do not exist." A week earlier, she had not even known for certain that the Argentine invasion would take place. Now she was learning at incredible speed and against incredible odds how to turn defeat into victory. More than almost any other war since 1945, the Falklands was a conflict where one side clearly won. In some ways, it may not have been good for Mrs. Thatcher's character that she so comprehensively confounded expectations by her victory. She may have come to believe too readily that she was at her best when she stood out against all other opinions. So she began to listen too little to other voices. But I would argue that in the conduct of the Falklands War itself, she showed no arrogance. Her undoubted courage was often tempered by a good dose of caution. One of her perennial pieces of wisdom was the old saw that time spent in reconnaissance is never wasted. I think she felt guilty that in the prelude to the Argentine invasion, she had not followed her own prescription. Her government had not done enough reconnaissance about the state of affairs in the South Atlantic. Its defence cuts, especially the announcement that Britain would get rid of the ice patrol vessel HMS Endurance, had sent the wrong signals to Argentina. Although instinctively supportive of people who, like the Falklanders, passionately wished to remain British, Mrs. Thatcher had not asserted her commitment to their right strongly enough as Argentina's impatience grew under its new junta. As the islanders saw with terrible clarity on the 2nd of April 1982, she had fallen down on the duty which she so often emphasised in the Cold War, the need to offer credible deterrence. Chris Collins is here tonight. He's the distinguished founder and editor of the great margaretthatcher.org website, and I think he's going to show in his forthcoming history of the Falklands War that Mrs. Thatcher could never bring herself, even in private, to admit these early errors and would not discuss them in her own memoirs. She was, however, aware of them, and that awareness affected her subsequent actions. Her embarrassment at the mistakes which provoked the invasion made her humbler, I think, in listening to military advice. She therefore saw it as her task to clear the way for the armed services whom she instinctively respected, rather than trying to tell them what to do. Once the invasion had happened, she was unceasingly thorough about how to mesh domestic politics and international diplomacy with the fact that the task force was at sea and could not, morally or politically, be brought home with its task unfulfilled. So to look at these questions in more detail, I think we should consider a couple of key moments. First of all, the legendary meeting in her room in the House of Commons, which took place on Wednesday the 31st of March 1982. By then, though intelligence remained poor, the invasion of the Falklands, almost unimaginable the previous month, was known to be imminent. By odd chance, almost all the key British players were abroad or out of action. The Foreign Secretary was in Israel, the Chief of the Defence Staff was in New Zealand, and the Commander-in-Chief Fleet in Gibraltar. The Permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office was retiring that week. So in her Commons room, Mrs. Thatcher was sitting with a collection of number twos, listening to wretched news and equally gloomy advice. She recalled this as, quote, the worst moment of my life. No senior armed services officer was present, and no one, including the Defence Secretary John Nott, the only Secretary of State in the room, was advising the Prime Minister how to recover the island. So John is here and will, I'm sure, wish to correct me if I'm saying anything out of turn. A cabinet meeting a week earlier had minuted that retaking the Falklands, once invaded, would be, quote, an almost impossible task. And then into Mrs. Thatcher's room, late and uninvited, strode the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach. He was wearing his day uniform after conducting naval inspections. Always brightened by the sight of military dress, Mrs. Thatcher looked up eagerly when Leach entered. Sir Henry was fired up by his anger over the cuts and his faith in the Royal Navy, which he'd imbibed from earliest childhood. I think his father was the captain of the Prince of Wales and went down with her, didn't he? Leach took the initiative by asking the Prime Minister for permission to send a task force to the South Atlantic. Everyone was silent. What does that mean? Asked Mrs. Thatcher. After Leach had explained, she asked how long it would take to assemble. 3 days, he said. How long to get there? 3 weeks, Prime Minister. 3 weeks, exclaimed Mrs. Thatcher, ignorant of the geography and the speed of sea travel. Surely you mean 3 days? He insisted on 3 weeks. Can we do it? Mrs. Thatcher asked Leach with burning urgency. We can, Prime Minister, and though it's not my place to say this, we must. Why do you say that? Because if we don't, if we pussyfoot, we'll be living in a totally different country whose word will count for little. At this, Leach told me, Mrs. Thatcher gave a sort of half smile, as if this was what she had been waiting to hear. He left the meeting with authority to assemble the task force. In the emergency Saturday debate in the Commons, the day after the invasion, Mrs. Thatcher was able to announce cabinet agreement to its imminent departure. Its first elements embarked 2 days later. This tale of the encounter with Leach seems almost too filmic to be true, but its essence is confirmed by other witnesses. Mrs. Thatcher was desperate to find a way of retaking the islands if they were invaded, but until then had lacked any expert advice that this could be done. She had therefore felt in no position to order a military response. It's a highly significant fact that until Leach's dramatic intervention, no positive advice had been given. It's evidence not only of unpreparedness, but also that no one high up in British government or administration actively wanted British sovereignty over the Falklands enforced. Even before a single Argentinian soldier had set boot on the islands, Whitehall and Westminster were assuming ultimate defeat. Leach's advice was the first to offer hope. Ignorant of military affairs though Mrs. Thatcher was, she did not instinctively share the prevailing negativity. Indeed, her ignorance may have guarded her against the pessimism which prevailed among so many Second World War veterans. I noticed this very much at the time, actually, being a young man with quite a lot of people who had fought in the war in the office of the Daily Telegraph. And I noticed those who'd fought in the war were the least likely to support the action. I think they just thought it was going to be impossible. Mrs. Thatcher was passionately anxious about the loss of British servicemen's lives, for which she always felt a motherly care. But she had perhaps less sense than old soldiers of just how many things could go wrong. She instinctively shared Leach's view that, quote, there's no point in having a navy if you couldn't use it. By character and because of her situation, She could take no refuge, as lesser ministers could, in a surrender half concealed by diplomatic face-saving. She knew that if Argentina stayed in possession of the Falklands, that would be the end of her country's international standing, her government, and her career. Sure enough, the fact that a task force had been ordered to sail saved Mrs. Thatcher's government in the House of Commons that Saturday. It forced even Michael Foot's left-wing Labour opposition to be seen to back British forces rather than attempt to bring down the government or confuse the House with peace plans. It had a similar effect on the Tory so-called wets. They had long opposed Mrs. Thatcher's economic policies, but they dared not directly oppose her over the Falklands. Secretly, they hoped that her new appointment as Foreign Secretary, Francis Pym, would emerge as her replacement when, as they expected, things went wrong. Mrs. Thatcher resisted any temptation to act rashly. Her bold decision to send the task force, far from making her careless about politics and diplomacy, made her super attentive to them. The British public and the House of Commons required steady progress towards the aim. This was constantly visible because the task force kept moving to the South Atlantic, followed by reinforcements. But the wider world required an air of reasonableness, an apparent readiness to get round the table and find what is often called a diplomatic solution. Sorry, is this yours, Dina?
Yes.
Do you mind if I give it to you? It's slightly distracting me as it sends messages. I think it's telling you to vote. Mrs. Thatcher had therefore readily accepted the advice of the British ambassador to the United Nations, Sir Anthony Parsons, that Britain should strike the first diplomatic blow, immediately tabling a Security Council resolution condemning the invasion and demanding the withdrawal of Argentine forces. Britain was invoking Article 51 of the UN Charter, which enshrines the right to self-defence. This was successfully passed, the Soviet Union abstaining rather than voting. This resolution, 502, became the model in Mrs. Thatcher's mind for future international crises caused by aggression, such as Saddam Hussein's against Kuwait in 1990. Her rule was, make sure of the legality of any response and secure global support, but do not let more complicated UN processes bog down subsequent armed reaction. And actually this became a bit of bone of contention between her and President Bush in the run-up to the first Gulf War, which actually took place just after she left office. She accepted Anthony Parsons' view that the best way of keeping the UN on side was to engage in active diplomacy in its forums, not letting a vacuum develop which could be filled by tiresome initiatives designed to delay matters and leave Argentina in possession. Even more important in Mrs. Thatcher's mind was the need to win the active support of the United States. Immediately after the invasion, she too readily assumed that her genuine friendship and ideological affinity with President Reagan would make American support unconditional. This was not the case, although right from the start, Caspar Weinberger at the Pentagon was shoveling military aid for Britain out of the back door without any presidential disapproval. The United States had strong interests in South America and may well, I expect to read more about this in Chris Collins's book, have winked at the Argentine military coup which had brought General Galtieri to power in December 1981. America always feared upheavals in its backyard which might empower communist insurgencies. Besides, it suited US interests to be seen as the broker of peace rather than the supporter of one side. As Reagan put it privately at the time, he wanted to, quote, get these two brawlers out of the barroom. Although irritated, Mrs. Thatcher quickly caught up with this reality. She understood the need to play along with the shuttles between London, Washington, and Buenos Aires by the US Secretary of State, General Alexander Haig, even though when he visited her in Downing Street, she pointedly showed him her portraits of Nelson and Wellington and declared, "The good Lord did not put me on this planet so that I could allow British citizens to be placed under the heel of Argentine dictators." She disliked the negotiations, but did not treat them solely as an unfortunately necessary charade. She always declared publicly that the wishes of the Falkland Islanders should be paramount in any settlement, and had told the cabinet that this was the government's absolute sticking point. But there were moments when she was persuaded to soften this demand. The most important of these came in early May, just as world opinion had been shaken by the British sinking of the Argentine cruiser, the Belgrano. In full cabinet on the 5th of May, Mrs. Thatcher found herself arguing among divided colleagues for acceptance of the latest so-called Peruvian, but really US, peace plan, which Hague was now offering up, and Reagan was pushing on her as a, quote, peaceful settlement. This involved a multinational interim administration of the islands without the consent of the islanders. According to the record, Mrs. Thatcher told colleagues that, "I fear we can't get wishes of people and self-determination into the text." She reluctantly advocated the plan's acceptance, all the same, in order to shore up international opinion. Anguished by the trap she felt herself to be in, Mrs. Thatcher drafted a personal letter to President Reagan after the meeting, speaking to him as, quote, "the only person who will understand the significance of what I'm trying to say." Her letter was highly emotional and appeared to circumvent what her own cabinet had just agreed. In the face of Reagan's claim to her that his suggestions were, quote, "faithful to the basic principles we must protect," she declared, "Alas, they are not." If the right of self-determination for the islanders was not defended, she said, then, quote, "our principles are no longer what we believe, nor those we were elected to serve, but what the dictator will accept. That our traditional friendship, to which I still loyally adhere, should have brought me and those I represent into conflict with fundamental democratic principles sounds impossible while you were in the White House and I am at number 10. Yet so she felt it had. The main point about this heartfelt letter is that though written, it was not sent. Mrs. Thatcher felt genuine anguish about the fate of the islanders if the Hague proposals were accepted by Argentina. But in the end, she decided it was impolitic to bypass her foreign secretary and speak to the US president in such an unguarded tone of outrage and sorrow. A much less passionate version of her letter was sent instead. It pleaded for a provision for locally elected representatives to be, quote, "at least consulted about any peace deal administration of the islands," but did not veto the Peruvian proposals being forwarded to Argentina. One cannot be absolutely certain what Mrs. Thatcher's game was here. It was in her character to disclaim all political sleights of hand and therefore never to explain, even in private, when she was executing one. Obviously, she was eager to secure full American backing before the final military assault became necessary, and therefore to try as far as possible to humour Reagan and even Hague. Less easy to ascertain is what she thought was likely to happen as a result of her government's concession over self-determination. Those closest to her thought she was calculating that Argentina would be too stiff-necked to accept the Hague Compromise. At the suggestion of John Mott, a similar gamble had paid off with an earlier proposal. If that is what she was calculating, her judgment was vindicated. Argentina rejected the peace plan. But there can be no doubt her concession had been offered. If Mrs. Thatcher's bluff had been called, the self-determination of the Falkland Islanders would have been lost. Her large claim made it a rally a few days earlier that Britain now had a world role of, quote, "upholding the law and teaching the nations of the world how to live," that latter phrase being an echo of John Milton, would have rung hollow. I focus on Mrs. Thatcher's reluctant flexibility on self-determination, not to show that she was untrustworthy, but to point out what an incredibly difficult hand she held. For the most part, she played it subtly. Given the absolute simplicity of her aims, complete removal of Argentine forces from the islands and complete restoration of British administration as Britain's sovereign right, she was remarkably patient in how she dealt with various attempts to deflect her. Her carefully projected self-image was of someone sticking to high principles at all times. But in fact, she was a more effective stateswoman because this image was partly false. Throughout the story of the Falklands crisis, we see her consistent in her end, but resourceful about her means. Her opponents, both at home and abroad, wanted to paint her into a corner as the inflexible warmonger, the block to peace. Because she was conscious of the need to avoid this, they failed. What did come through instead was her sincerity. First, there was a concern for the islanders themselves. Not for her the condescension sometimes expressed in educated British circles towards fewer than 2,000 people outnumbered more than 200 to 1 by their sheep. both in public and in private, she dramatised their plight. When later, shortly before battle could be joined, Reagan rang to ask her if she would hold off military action to give a new backdoor negotiation via Brazil time to work, she refused. The Falklanders, she told the president, were, quote, a loyal, true and thrifty people, those would be words that she really liked, who wanted to, quote, live their own lives. The two greatest democracies should surely protect that wish, she said. Second, there was her ardent, womanly anxiety about the lives of British troops. Her husband Dennis recalled going up to their Downing Street bedroom shortly before the final reconquest. News had come through that the Atlantic conveyor had been hit. He told me he found his wife sitting on the end of the bed in tears, crying, oh no, another ship, all my young men. That's what war's like, love, he told her. I've been in one. In the private memoir she wrote a year later, Mrs. Thatcher described the day of victory with high emotion, and she was thinking, above all, of the troops. As I went to sleep very late that night, I felt an enormous burden had been lifted from my shoulders. Victory, she wrote, was, quote, a miracle wrought by ordinary men and women with extraordinary qualities, forever bold, forever brave, forever remembered. Finally, there was her genius for drawing a general moral out of a specific, and in this case, most peculiar situation. Throughout the crisis, she endlessly repeated the lesson that aggression against a free people must not pay. In the era of the Cold War, she saw this as an organizing principle for the defense of the free world. It's a mark of her great success in spreading this message that it was most elegantly expressed, most clearly expressed by another. On the 8th of June, with the war still not quite won, President Reagan addressed MPs and peers in the Royal Gallery of the Houses of Parliament. It made a great impression, not least because of the magic of him talking without reading, because people didn't know what the autocue was. It was the first time it was used in this country. And in a passage Reagan wrote himself and interpolated into his text, he said, on distant islands in the South Atlantic, young men are fighting for Britain. And yes, voices have been raised protesting their sacrifice for lumps of rock and earth so far away. But those young men aren't fighting for mere real estate. They fight for a cause, for the belief that armed aggression must not be allowed to succeed, that the people must participate in the decisions of government under the rule of law. Only 5 weeks earlier, the United States had still not come down on the British side. Only 9 days earlier, Reagan had rung Mrs. Thatcher trying to get a ceasefire out of her. Now, in her own parliament, here he was, endorsing not only the rightness of the Falklands cause, but its universal application. Her view had triumphed. The world noticed, especially the Soviet Union. A good rule for leaders in military operations is don't forget who's watching you. Not just your immediate enemies, of course, but the wider world. In the case of the Falklands conflict, Argentina gave this almost no thought at all, winning few allies abroad. Mrs. Thatcher did think about it. The watching Soviets saw that here was a full projection of force over a huge distance and the notoriously tough proposition of an opposed landing, both successful. This was evidence of a depth of military capability they lacked. Even more important for them, perhaps, were the wider lessons. Although the operation was unilaterally British and out of NATO area, the Falklands story ultimately confirmed the formidable depth of the Atlantic alliance. The United States tilted decisively to Britain, and France, often inclined to its own frolics, came down fast on the British side. Even the European Economic Community, as the EU then was, imposed immediate sanctions on Argentina. The other lesson was one of leadership. After the weakness of the 1970s, culminating in the failure of Jimmy Carter's 1980 mission to rescue the hostages in Iran, the Falklands proved that a democratic leader in the new decade could decide to use force across the world in the national interest and win enough support in Parliament, media and public opinion to see it through. Just as the task force restored the status quo in the islands, so its victory restored the sense of possibility in Britain and the free world more generally. This blew back on the Soviets. It was they who, as a sexist joke, had first described Mrs. Thatcher when leader of the opposition as the Iron Lady. Now she had proved that it was no joke at all, but the plain truth. All this changed the calculus for enemies of the West and the West's own attitude to itself. The post-Vietnam spell that the bad guys were bound to win was broken, and the most prominent good guy was a woman. Before finishing, I should like to discuss what we might apply from this stirring story 40 years on. Could something comparable happen today? Do we in the West retain the same general capacity for action as was displayed in 1982? I'm not talking so much here about the defence of the Falkland Islands themselves. Ever since June 1982, they have been well protected. A garrison of roughly 1,000 armed service personnel guards the islands, with air cover to look after South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, and monitor fishing and other activity in the Southwest Atlantic. If Argentina tried to repeat what it did in 1982, it would be much worse placed than it was then. Although it is worth noting that in recent years, Argentina has grown close to China over arms trading, the hog industry, soybeans, and help with the pandemic. Argentina may now be likelier to do China's will in international forums than that of Western powers. And of course, that's a much wider problem than just Argentina. But no, I'm talking more globally. So many things have changed in apparently unfavorable ways. The media provide an obvious example. At the time of the Falklands War, there was no internet, no social media, and hardly any mobile telephones. Even Parliament itself was not televised. Because of the remoteness of the islands, almost all media coverage on the spot came from British reporters, cameramen and photographers travelling with and controlled by the task force. Such tight news management, unusual even then, is unimaginable today. I think I'm right in saying, for example, I'm not absolutely certain of this, that the British public never saw a single photograph of a dead British serviceman. A war covered by social media today would be much tougher on a free country than on a dictatorship. Something similar applies to the 21st invasion of the battlefield by lawyers, whether this be over the law of armed combat, the claims of human rights, or the growing rights of service personnel to sue their employers. The world of law firms such as Lee Day and public interest lawyers does not mix with the world of Margaret Thatcher, though no politician was more punctilious than she about getting legal advice before dangerous operations. She understood that legality, rightly handled, can be a force multiplier more than a straitjacket. Nowadays, however, politicians seem to run scared and forget that lawyers issue only advice, not orders. Or again, wars today are not strictly military conflicts. Note, by the way, that only 3 civilians were killed in the Falklands. Their wars today are what people call full spectrum, involving cyber, propaganda spread by state-backed Twitter posts, technologies unthought of 40 years ago, sometimes lethality capable of delivery from thousands of miles away. And now we hear on high authority the Russians may be able to cut the undersea cables which secure 99% of world communications. In Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014, Russia used extensive cyber activity to confuse within and without the conflict, to conduct information operations, to convince the resisting forces not to fight or confuse them about where the fight was, and persuade foreign powers that there was no fight until it was too late for their intervention to count. In recent years in the Palestinian conflict, Israel has used Iron Dome to provide a shield against incoming missiles and in an increasingly active cyber and information campaign backed up by precision strike operations rather than more conventional army interventions on the ground. As for China, one could almost say that it's built its own series of Falkland Islands in the South China Sea. These it defends not with Galtieri-era garrisons, but with a fleet of suspiciously uniformed trawlers known as its maritime militia, and an aggressive and well-armed coast guard. It ties up foreign powers in the courts while ignoring the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. China declares ownership of the airspace around these islands and defends this with radars and missile sites on them and ballistic and hypersonic carrier killer missiles safely siloed many hundreds of miles away on its mainland. All the while, a campaign of what's called grey zone activity is waged to keep foreign powers on the back foot unable or unwilling to challenge this pattern of Chinese behaviour. There's also greater complication on the home front in many Western countries today, caused by less homogeneous populations. As the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan showed, significant numbers of British Muslims took a different view on the issues from that of the wider population, or most of the wider population. The British are well used to foreign wars, having taken in part, on average, I believe, once every 6 years since the 18th century. But obviously it's harder to assume popular consent if cultural or religious differences increase at home. Our justified returning interest in nation states today should not fool us that non-state actors have ceased to matter. One of them, the Taliban, has recently recaptured an entire state, the exact opposite of what was supposed to happen. So these are all important points, but I now draw attention to some which might weigh on the other, more positive side. One is that we have now moved away from the early 21st century idea of humanitarian intervention, so-called, and the delusions this can cause. In his first speech as the new Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin declared last month that we are witnessing, quote, the return of the state as the central indispensable feature of the international system. This complements thinking of the Prime Minister's main foreign policy advisor, John Bew, who's written of the, quote, revenge of the nation state. With this, the new CDS went on, has returned the, quote, traditional notion of British national interest, with nations contesting, competing, cooperating with and confronting one another. This has meant, among other things, that we are according renewed importance to the Navy and its aircraft carriers, the situation which prevailed in the Falklands conflict. This is also more broadly a situation which Mrs. Thatcher thought essential to the successful conduct of war. Alliances can deliver only if their main participating nations are states strong enough to make their own military decisions and stick with them, offering repeatability, dependability, and popular support. It's remarkable how few democratic countries in the world are truly in such a situation. The United States and Britain are, so probably is France, so is Australia, so is Israel, so are a few small but determined countries such as Norway. To wage war successfully, you must have an independent nation state behind you. When you win, you find you can help make the rules in the world. In the end, I return to the least technical and least strictly military lessons of the Falklands War. I return to that need not to forget who is watching you. In Iraq and Afghanistan this century, this was forgotten too often. As a result, China, which watches what the West does much more closely than the West has watched China these past 20 years, may believe that the West does not have the will to assert itself, whether trying to order the affairs of the Middle East or defending Taiwan. Iran is currently wondering whether it can get away with posing a nuclear and ballistic threat to Britain and our allies. Russia, also watching, is testing whether the West means what it says in relation to Ukraine. We may see merciless applications of these Russian tests in the coming weeks. These nation states hostile to our interests and values will flourish at our expense if we in the West feel embarrassed about upholding ours. Are we yet ready to pass such tests? I fear not. I do not yet see a clear enough relationship between Western beliefs and ideas and Western military policy, whereas I do unfortunately see a clear relationship between what President Vladimir Putin says about Russia and what he wants to do in Ukraine, or what President Xi Jinping says about China's role in the world and what he wants to do about Taiwan and is doing with his Belt and Road initiative. The one note of optimism I can strike is that we in the West are much more aware of the dangers than we were in the so-called golden era 5 years ago. The example of Margaret Thatcher 40 years ago shows the overwhelming importance in military affairs of political will. All politics is a test of what leaders really want, and it frequently exposes that they have neither furnished the means to implement their decisions nor defined the end. War provides by far the most extreme of these tests, with nowhere to hide when things go wrong. In the Falklands War, with the world watching, Mrs. Thatcher established an impressively close relationship between what she said and what she did. For her, democracy and liberty, self-determination, strong Western military alliances to oppose tyranny, rule of law, property rights were not just words, but were actively, boldly defended. Perhaps in secret, Mrs. Thatcher did not agree with Queen Victoria that the possibilities of failure did not exist. After all, they seemed shockingly real at the time. But she recognised unflinchingly that failure would mean the end of her and of everything she believed in and had hoped to achieve for her country. Success had to be achieved, so it was achieved. This is what made the Falklands so utterly different from decline of empire situations such as Aden or even Malaya, where the ultimate purpose was to get out. Here, the one and only purpose was to get back in. At the end of March 1982, there appeared to be, in Matthew Arnold's phrase in another context, an unplumbed, salt, estranging sea between Britain and the repossession of her most distant lands. By June, it looked quite different. It was a tide in the affairs of men and women which Margaret Thatcher took at the flood. I'll just end with the briefest description of Mrs. Thatcher's victory celebration in 10 Downing Street. It's very well known, but it does bring out the uniqueness of her situation. She wished to give a dinner to thank all those most intimately involved in the Falklands campaign. So many people deserved a seat at the table that spouses could be asked only to drinks in the drawing rooms afterwards. The wives duly gathered and waited. Of all the 120 principals invited to the dinner, there was only one woman, the Prime Minister. After the CDS, Lord Lewin spoke in reply to Mrs. Thatcher's speech of thanks. She rose once more. Gentlemen, she proposed, shall we join the ladies?
Thank you for that brilliant address, Charles. I'm sure there'll be many questions. And do I see any takers? Must be. Please raise your electronic hands if you're outside. Gentleman there, name and organisation, please. If you take the microphone.
Thank you. Julian Brazier, Pathway Risk Management and former MP. Brilliant, Charles, really brilliant. There's a very intriguing passage in your book, elsewhere in your book, where you say when Margaret Thatcher separated the sheep from the goats among the wets, she divided them according to their performance in the Second World War. Rather striking point. Do you think that had anything to do with the fact that she'd come through the Falklands War, or do you think it was just a separate instinct?
Forgive me, I don't remember saying that. But, you know, I don't fully remember my own book. I mean, she had a great admiration for military achievements and she always admired soldiers. But if you think of the, I think, 3 men in her cabinet who had the MC, Carrington, Pym, and who was the Whitelaw. Of course, she had a good relationship with Whitelaw, and in a way, actually, a good relationship with Carrington, a bad relationship with Pym. But anyway, it didn't either save them or obviously didn't condemn them. I'm very interested. I mean, I think the Second World War had the most enormous effect on Mrs. Thatcher, and in a way more passionate, in an odd way, than people who actually served in it, because I think it made her less ready to sort of, she had none of the camaraderie of soldiers for their opponents. You often find that veterans say how frightful their allies were, useless the French were at Dunkirk or whatever, and admire the Germans. Partly it's a way of praising oneself in a way that you're up against. I don't think she had any of that sense at all. I think it was pure, this awful, awful attack by the Germans on us. And she had deeply influenced by all of that, and saw it in a different way from how a soldier sees it.
Thank you. Gentleman there, second row from the front. Name and organisation.
Alan West, Simple Sailor. I wondered how Margaret Thatcher reacted to that appalling calumny of accusing her of sort of war crimes and things for sinking the Belgrano, which was absolutely the right decision to be made. And indeed, if it hadn't been for shallow water, we'd have sunk the Argentine aircraft carrier on the same day as well. But it went on. And how did she feel about that? What impact did that have on her?
I don't think the Belgrano did trouble her conscience. I mean, obviously it's a difficult decision, but quite unlike all the filmic presentations of it, for example, in the Meryl Streep one, I think, you see her sort of striding around with one of those things which you'll be more familiar than I, when women move ships on boards, and she says, "Sink it," as if it's sort of. And actually, it was a tremendously collective decision, where there was nobody arguing against this, and where the military and naval advice took precedence. So, and it was all conducted in, I mean, it was conducted at Chequers, so it wasn't quite like a normal average meeting, but it was a full meeting. It wasn't it was absolutely not so for government. And the idea that somehow she alone, because of her ruthlessness or callousness or whatever, had, no, that wasn't, that didn't like it, of course, but it didn't bother her. And do remember that what she's thinking about all the time is how many of our people are going to be sunk and killed. What's the purpose of what Belgrano was trying to do, and so on.
Gentleman there, name and organisation front.
Andrew Roberts, Policy Exchange Trustee. You mentioned that Charles Hawkey of Ireland behaved badly. In what way?
Well, I can't quite remember the details now, but it was a UN stuff. And I think, sorry, I ought to have this. I think he was trying to get a motion for a ceasefire. And there was a lot of sort of jiggery-pokery. And it was a terrible mistake on his part, actually, because it really did mean that ever afterwards she didn't trust him. Well, funnily enough, she'd got on fairly well with him before.
And just following on from that, Charles, about sort of moments of ill conscience, which you referred to, about things that have gone wrong. I think she felt that also subsequently about the Anglo-Irish Agreement of '85, and I'm interested in the dissonance between the militant defence of the consent principle for Falkland Islanders, but its dilution in the context of the Anglo-Irish Agreement of '85, and the whole question of consistency and in her approach to the rights of British subjects, whether in overseas territories or indeed within the United Kingdom itself.
Yes, well, funnily enough, I remember this vividly because it's the first time I ever had a conversation with Mrs. Thatcher, which was just after the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and I was at some dinner in the House of Commons, and I said, why did you re-establish the rights of the British in the Falkland Islands, and why are you giving them away in the Anglo-Irish Agreement? Or words to that effect. And, and of course, I got, I mean, one of the great good qualities of Mrs. Thatcher was that though she was absolutely terrifying, she also wanted to have the argument rather than just sort of kick you out of the room. And so she sort of came hammering back, and very much in the Thatcher style, the way she did it was a sort of ad hominem argument, or taking a particular example. So she said, do you know that the Protestant councils are refusing to collect refuse from Catholic dustbins? And as what she was trying to say was, they're also bigoted, these people, you know, there's got to be a new way. But she didn't answer, to try to respond to the point at all, and I think she was troubled, well, we know, because she said later that she was troubled by the concessions of principle about giving another state, the Irish Republic, the power to decide various things within part of the United Kingdom. And she was never happy about that. I think her repentance was not total, and I think she sort of knew that she had to do it for all sorts of long and complicated reasons, but she was uneasy about it.
Thank you. Gentleman there in the middle, and name and organisation, please.
John Moynihan, private citizen. Charles, good evening. Wonderful talk. Your remarks about Lady Thatcher's affection for Mitterrand and her belief that he supported her may be true, but may have been misplaced. I, some years ago, had a conversation with the gentleman who I think was the sort of Q of the time, in other words, responsible for technical stuff during the war. And he did get the military OBE, so I'm assuming that what he said had a lot of credence. He said that Mitterrand assured her that there was no kill switch on the exocet. and several ships were sunk because we were unable to prevent the exocet. But they found out via Chile that there was a kill switch and that the Argentinian vessels had one on it. And later he claimed he flew over to Langley and was covertly handed the device that created the kill signal to the exocet, which saved several vessels as a result. But that all the time Mitterrand was assuring Margaret Thatcher that there was no kill switch, and even had technicians on the island with the Argentinians directing the firing of land-based exocets from Port Stanley at our ships, one of which hit, was it Glamorgan? I can't remember. And that allegedly, according to this chap, the last flight out before our troops reached Port Stanley contained those French technicians, and the military asked permission to shoot it down, and Mrs. Thatcher, possibly because of what you've said, denied them permission to shoot those French technicians out of the sky. Do you have any comment on any of that?
Well, thank you very much, John. It's a very interesting subject, and I've heard some of this. I haven't heard the last point at all about the technicians, but I've heard some of this. I think Chris, I'm sure, will shed more light on it when he's ready. All I would really say is that Mrs. Thatcher, by the way, did have some doubts. As I say, she was favourable towards Mitterrand, but she did have some worries about this later on, about what had really happened. I think what one always has to think about Mitterrand is that his sort of absolutely profound ambiguity about everything. So was he on the side of the resistance or of the Free French? And the answer is both. And was he on the side of Britain or Argentina in the Falklands? And the answer is both. And that is just the most extraordinary character of the man. But I'd love to know more of the details of the story, and I don't know more details.
Thank you. I see two people from off-site, as it were. Michael Rose, Falklands veteran. Can you hear me? Michael Rose, can you hear?
Very well. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
My background is I'm just a simple soldier, not quite as simple, of course, as Adam West, a simple sailor, but one of my students at the Staff College. I'd like to ask a question about Admiral Fieldhouse, for whom I have enormous regard. Fieldhouse said towards the end of the war that he deeply regretted not having had an integrated joint headquarters at Northwood. Charles said that no military man appeared at the original meeting in Parliament, which Margaret Thatcher held. Actually, no senior army officer arrived in Northwood till well after a month after the end of the war. After the start of the war. Can you say why Margaret Thatcher, or explain why Margaret Thatcher didn't insist from the outset that it should be a joint service operation rather than a single service operation? And when it was a joint service operation, obviously the Navy would be in the lead, but they would have the advice and the participation of the Air Force and the Army, which never happened.
I don't know the real answer to that, but I think, except to repeat a point in a way that I made earlier, but Michael, thank you, by the way, and thank you. Let me take this opportunity to thank you for your kind contribution to my book on this, on your role in the Falklands and what happened in the Falklands. I think, no, I would repeat the point I made about her in general in this, that you could almost say that her role in that sort of question was passive. She wasn't going to say, it's got to be this way. If she was hearing, what she did was she trusted Fieldhouse, she trusted Lewin, which I'm sure was the right thing to do, and to a lesser extent she trusted the other commanders, but they were the most important. And I don't think she would have had the capacity to make the decision unless it was sort of plainly put to her and she had to decide about that issue. But I can't give you sort of chapter and verse on that.
Thank you. Final question from Martin Dobbs of the Falklands Islands Association. Can you hear me?
Hello, yes, I can hear you. I'm a one-time resident of the Falkland Islands many, many years ago, and I have been a member of the Falkland Islands Association for many years also. do you think we have yet, as a nation, really learnt the importance of convincing sceptical international opinion about the Falklands beyond our natural allies?
Well, probably not, because I don't think it's ever going to be easy to interest international opinion in this very much, unless there's some great strategic importance emerges for the Falkland Islands, which might well happen with China trying to take over the pole, but probably not. But I think what you can do, and what we failed to do before 1982, and we've done ever since, is you can provide a consistent message about what you, in this case Britain, wants to do about the islands, and what you want to do about their status, and how you will defend their status. And then if that message keeps coming through, people are very unlikely to challenge it, or much less likely to challenge it.
Thank you. I think that's all for questions. All that remains for me is to call upon Right Honourable Ben Wallace MP, Secretary of State for Defence, and of course also himself a Scots Guards veteran regiment which played so distinguished a part in the Falklands campaign. Ben, thank you for coming tonight.
And all my friends' parents went off to war in that Falklands War, and I remember marvelling at the following year at the Yeovilton Air Show at seeing the captured Pukaras and all those things. And it was, I suppose it was the conflict of my childhood that I remember with clarity, and indeed, I suppose, sows the seeds for admiration for Margaret Thatcher, but also for our military. And I can remember the almost daily news reports done in a way that I'm sure all politicians today would like, a controlled, measured, lack of sensationalism, lack of Twitter. Who can forget I counted them all out and I counted them all back coming over the internet? Or the screen grab of Tumbledown, who would have thought a few years later I'd have been in the same regiment, where all you saw was Tracer going off into the dark. I mean, that was the pictures you got, nothing more and nothing less. But I'm here to provide the vote of thanks and nothing more. So I want to express my great appreciation for Charles Barronmore of Etchingham's lecture this evening. And first, though, can I also thank the Policy Exchange and Dean Lord Godson and his team for hosting such an event in this new location. It's a timely consideration of this pivotal episode in our recent national history, not to mention the group assembled this evening. No other think tank has such timing, nor indeed connections. This is, of course, just the latest in the Thatcher lecture series, and we also have to thank the Falkland Islands government, represented in London and tonight by Richard Hislop, for creating and sustaining such a viable and living memorial to the achievements of Margaret Thatcher in the liberation of your and our islands. On which note, there are more words written on her leadership or that conflict that I could ever have read or read, but it's important that our understanding of history evolves with us, and I'm delighted that Dr. Christopher Collins, the founder and editor of the MargaretThatcher.org archives, is now preparing an update on the record of the war. But crucially, special thanks to Charles Moore, the official biographer of Margaret Thatcher, but more importantly, the only biographer worth reading, who has himself evolved with our national politics, but remains every day as current and as cutting as he did when those Daily Telegraph leaders were written by him 40 years ago. Charles, tonight you've offered us a great historical insight, but not only that, also the gripping narrative about the events of 1982, and most importantly, you have captured the essence of the political military decision-making that makes the Falkland War so important for us today. Not just modern day, but I mean this very day. Everyone is aware of the events in Europe this week, and earlier I updated the House on our concern about Russia's ongoing aggression towards Ukraine and simplistic efforts to distract attention with false claims and narratives about NATO expansionism. So while we are hopeful for the best outcomes from this week's diplomatic efforts, we should not be overly optimistic and must prepare for the worst. The parallels with 40 years ago barely need articulating, but for me the most valuable are that threats to our country, our people, our allies, and our territory come from any direction and at any time. We must always be ready, and we must always invest in our armed forces over the long term. Our enemies should not doubt Britain's determination to stand up to bullies, to defend those that cannot defend themselves, and for our values. Distance should not deter Britain, nor will the scale of the challenge. And history is littered with the consequences of those that underestimated this small island. And General Galtieri was no different. Because defence secretaries must constantly compete not only for attention, but also for resources in this complex and fast-moving age. The poems of Tommy Atkins are as relevant today as they were when they were written. And sometimes defence has been acting over these last few years like the COVID Pied Piper, and I'll be interesting to see if the Burgmeister of Hamelin pays the price at the end of this pandemic. It's not just important for defence to be present and powerful and strong and well-equipped in times of war, but because of its deterrent effects. Those political signals that well-equipped soldiers, sailors and aviators send that help to deter conflict and maintain peace. But fundamentally, securing those resources, maintaining that focus, remains also about the sheer belligerence in leadership that is required to simply insist upon what others tell you cannot be done. Others might call that belligerence resolve, and where that is most appropriate is the consistent application of our values. We must be staunch and not go wobbly, as Margaret Thatcher would say. But we must also be resolute in our belief in our own values of freedom, democracy, rule of law, and the simple British sense of fair play. When I visited South Korea last year, I was struck by that strong motto that freedom is not free. And I thought Charles captured that perfectly in his quoting of Thatcher's letter drafted to Reagan. That said, if we do not defend the Falkland Islanders' right to self-determination, then our principles are no longer what we believe, nor those we were elected to serve, but what the dictator will accept. And also, as he rightly said, others are watching. Ukraine matters because China is watching. The Falkland Islands mattered because the Soviets were watching. And those were vital lessons that we should take from it. And on this 40th year, we shouldn't forget the great heroism in the Falklands War. And we must never forget the human achievement and sacrifices that it delivered. Not just in the 16,000-mile round trip of the Falklands Task Force, or its 127 ships and 70 aircraft and 9,000 personnel, or indeed the 255 personnel who paid the ultimate sacrifice to achieve that task force objectives, but also in the experience and emotions of all those who served, and many of who are here this evening. Every one of their personal sacrifices wrote the pages of our history books. I was privileged to have served with a regiment that fought in the Falklands conflict. In their 380 years history, the Scots Guards have beaten Hitler, Napoleon, Tsar Nicholas I, and even George Washington at the Battle of Brandywine Creek. Their own tale of a journey from public duties to Tumbledown Mountain is a measure of the quality of the British soldier. And the lesson from the Falkland Islands for the military was to demand ruthless professionalism. And if you visit the armed forces today, you will find a level of professionalism way above, I think, the levels I would have achieved. I'm always coming back from places like Sandhurst thinking, I'm not sure I would have got there now. And we should never weaken our belief in the principle of mission command. Our young leaders are our strength in our armed forces for the size we have. And if you look at the documentaries on the Falkland Islands, the most striking thing there is how senior commanders had so small a window to talk to their junior and middle-ranking commanders. People were left to command. People were trusted to command. Mission command is often the thing that should set us apart from our very large ally and friend, the United States. We must trust our commanders to lead. And I believe Margaret Thatcher trusted her commanders. But also the lessons were readiness and presence matters. The Soviets and now the Russians know that readiness matters. They know that speed can be of the essence. The United States and China know that presence around the world matters. Even if you are fairly static, by being there, you deter. By being there, you invest. And I think we must also remember that even our response to Argentinian aggression was not one-dimensional. It was also coordinated with diplomatic efforts and alliances and friendships and intelligence. And that today is as true now as it should be. It's why in my Defence Command paper I invested in increasing the Defence Attaché network, increasing the coverage around the world, because intelligence sharing and defence engagement is the earliest act of influence and exploitation and helping Britain's allies and working on those levers of powers. So tonight I'd like to thank Charles for an excellent lecture. I think what we're seeing today in Europe sadly shows that some leaders in the world have not learnt to respect the sovereignty of other nations. And I hope that the rest of Europe and NATO stand firm against the current aggression that we see on the borders of Ukraine. Perhaps I'll leave with one wonderful phrase from Margaret Thatcher, who once said, "Socialists don't like ordinary people choosing because they might not choose socialism." The Kremlin doesn't like ordinary countries choosing because they might not choose the Kremlin. Thank you very much. Good night.